Hello, welcome to Film 253 Narrative for the Digital Age. Today we're going to talk about how elements of narrative space of the film are combined, manipulated, or synthesized. How we mentally map the multiple subplots of the film. Unlike the vertical structure of linear cinema, modern films sometimes use horizontal structure to map out and focus on multiple paths of narrative and their relationship with each other. So the films that I want to discuss this week, like the films of Robert Altman or Asghar Farhadi, do not reject the linear, the vertical aspects of the narrative. But what is important in this film is the intersection, the relationship between the vertical and the horizontal elements. One filmmaker who rejected the classical conventions of Hollywood narrative films was Jean Renoir, the son of the artist Renoir. Jean Renoir, in one of his famous films, La Règle de Jeu, The Rules of the Games, foregrounds multiple characters that they are all important to the overall story of the film. So instead of focusing on the central leading characters, all the secondary characters are serving an important role within the plot of the film. The plot of the film is complex and there are multiple subplots in the film, but they all intersect at some point that we can carefully construct a map of the events in this film. This is also tied into the ideological beliefs of the director, and we have two social groups, and these love triangles interact with each other. What is interesting, you can see this non-hierarchical multiplicity in the mise en scène of the film through the use of deep focus photography. There are layers, like there's something is happening in the background, something is happening in the foreground. And so no actor is without act. So there are multiple actions at the same time, and they are all related in a way. The characters are all related to each other and to these subplots of the film. So what I call the visibility of a space in every shot of the film is an interesting way Renoir used for foregrounding multiple characters. And at the end, all these various subplots will be combined disastrously. You can look at the next scene that I've taken from the DVD commentary on the Criterion release of this film.
The key word here, of course, is apparent. Renoir's casual style actually resulted from extremely careful planning. For Bazin, Renoir's casualness was linked to a sense of realism in his films. This seems paradoxical, since The Rules of the Game is essentially a bittersweet comedy of manners, built around the capricious and often absurd behavior of its characters. The plot is very carefully constructed. There are systematic parallels and contrasts between the upper-class characters and the servants. Such comedies are not typically realistic, yet through Renoir's stylistic choices, he manages to create a sense of capturing the messiness and eventually the chaos of his characters' lives. Nowhere is that more evident than in the complex staging of the actors in The Rules of the Game.
A filmmaker was inspired by the works of Jean Renoir, but at the same time was a very influential figure for the 90s narrative revolution in Hollywood was Robert Altman. His films, such as Gosford Park, was very similar to the structure of films such as The Rules of the Games. So he was making these mosaic narrative or network narrative films in the 70s and the 80s. And I think he was a pioneer character and had a significant role in the 90s um, ensemble narrative films such as Pulp Fiction, films of Thomas Anderson's or Run Lola Run. Altman films do have many characters, and for this reason, the introduction part of the story is lengthy. So remember, three acts of structure. Usually, the introduction is just 1/4 of the entire film time. So usually in Ultimate films, because there are multiple characters being introduced and they all have significant roles in advancing the storyline, we usually have a longer introduction. Roger Ebert talks about the idea of community on a screen when we think of Robert Altman films. It seems that this network of personalities that they are all somehow related, and in the beginning usually it's confusing. But the whole thing is that unlike Hollywood films, it's not about the central point of view of this central character. So in that term, the advantage of to represent different personalities, like in Three Women, for example, all possible female personalities in contemporary society and how they might act in a situation are presented. It's like catalog of different personalities. Still, his films are linear, but the large cast of characters are combined with intervening narratives. So look at how confusing the arrival scene of a wedding is, that you can not really recognize the central characters. It in a way, it is telling us what to expect from the ensemble cast of the story.
And look, isn't it pretty? Nice color in your cheeks. Have a good everybody. You get your little sisters when I'm all in.
In this week, we're going to focus on complex narrative structure of Asghar Farhadi films. He was an Iranian filmmaker. He was actually making movies in the tradition of realism, the poetic realism of Iranian cinema. However, in the last couple of decades, the focus of his films shifted towards the middle class society in Iran, or the crisis of middle class society in relationship with other classes in the society. And at this point in his career, he started to develop the interesting narrative techniques, very carefully written plot, very well designed plot, but at the same time, a plot that follows a classical storyline. Although usually his films are open-ended, but it follows this kind of realistic universe of the movie still follows the events, and the audience is going to discover about what's going on like a detective character. The reading suggested that we usually are confronted with the construction of fragile but at the same time a stable narrative universe of the film and the complex relationship between the characters. And after that, we have violent ruptures of that fragile universe and the balance. So there are unexpected, tragic catastrophes. And at the end, the audience is presented with an incomplete closure of the story. Although his films usually have central characters, the interesting part is that usually the minor characters will become more important in advancing the plot in the climaxes that what we expected from the beginning. And minor events that are portrayed in the film, we realize that how they all serve the main plot of the film. So in terms of the relationship between the story and plot, certain things happens in the story, the way the plot organized, that we realize that there's always something bigger, a bigger universe of the story. It's not like the films of Christopher Nolan's that they would trick us, but it always say that telling us that there's something more. In this study of a scene that I found on YouTube from About Ellie, one of Farhadi's film, you can see the complex relationship between the characters in the film. There are multiple characters, they're all going for vacation. And you can see in this scene how the mise en scène is also supporting this multiplicity of viewpoints, and how we should expect what character should be at the center of our focus.
من این خانم دعوت کردم من گفتم جلوی لب آب بگیریم من نذاشتم بره تهران. من کردم شما بری
موبایل ایلی بزنی بگیر امیر جان موبایل ایلیو بگیر مرسی بچه این قفلش چجور رو میشه؟
من زنگ بزن به یکی از شماره‌های گفت داده موبایلش
ولی شاید حدوده ساعت چند بود من باش رفتم بیرون 8 و نیم بود فکر میکنم تو راه موبایلش زنگ خورد گفت آشناس بعدا باش تماس میگیره خب به همون شماره زنگ بزن اصل داستان رو بهش بگو دیگه
من میگم ما هم باید بمونیم خانواده‌اش اگه بیان دنبالش ببینن فقط 4 تا مرد اینجاست شک نمی‌کنن
مامانش همینجوری هم مشکوک بود
مگه نگفتین زنگ زدین کسی گوشو برداشت؟
حالا یه 10 دقیقه صبر کنیم من میرم یه زنگ میزنم ببینم چی میشه دیگه
مگه تو با مادرش صحبت کردی؟
مامانش اصلا خبر نداشت دختر شما
من شه بیار رو ماشینه
رو ماشینه همه چی شد بچه ها؟
گوشو
ها؟
کسی گوشی رو برنداشت
ای بابا گفت بزنم به این شانس
واقعا شد
مخواستیم بگیریم بازم هم اول
رفتیم دیگه
در رفتیم
سپیده ببین
چیه؟
دختر موبایلش کجاست؟
واسه چی؟
تو شما رو از توش پیدا کنیم زنگ میزنیم فتح خانهش بود تموم شد دیگه
برده با خودش
کجا بردی؟
نمیدونم چی داری می‌پرسی توی مثلا یا برده تو یا رفت
بیا اینجا
چیزه تو؟
اگه چیزی میگه ازش بگو
چی میدونم ازش؟
مال کی؟ برای دیگه
کجا بود؟
تو کیفه موبایلم تو کیفه چیکار میکنی؟
اصلا یا دیشب اومدم الان راه بیام اینجا دیدم پشت پنجره بود برشتاشم گوشتارش تو کیف
به من دروغ نگو به من دروغ نگو
تو من اذیت نکن به دیگم کسافت
چه مرگته تو؟ چرا حرف نمیزنی؟ کسافت
امیر خشالت بکش بلخم میگم
کسافت تو نخورم نکن شاده
پاشو برو ماشین شو خشالت بکش اینجا میگیم برو سوار ماشین شو بریم با من برای تهرانم اون غرق شد رفت مرد ما هم میخوایم بکشیم بریم من اینجا نمیمونم یک دقیقه دیگه
چیکار داری دروغ میگه من میخوام بدونم این موبایل این دختر تو کیف تو چیکار میکنه چیکار داری میکنی تو چیکار داری میکنی امیر تو دخالت نکن تو حرف نزن احمدی تو یکی حرف نزن
چرا هیچی نمیگه هر چیزی هست نگه من هر کی میخواد اینجا بمونه من نمیمونم بریم ما زمین برسیم تو خوبی؟ احمد
About Ellie is a very interesting film in terms of its narrative structure, but because it was not available online through the library catalog, I chose another film by Asghar Farhadi, The Salesman, that actually won the Oscar for Best Foreign Film for the second time actually in Asghar Farhadi's life. This film is very interesting in a very similar way as the movie Birdman that was made in 2014. Farhadi uses a theatrical production of Death of a Salesman as the counterpoint to the film's story. It is not easy to recognize a connection between the characters of Death of a Salesman and this movie. Also, there are other intertextual references to other films and text in this movie. So when watching it, try to recognize how the narrative universe of the film has been designed. Try to see if you can see a connection between Arthur Miller's play and the relationship between the characters.